The executive of NVIDIA said something recently that every startup founder needs to hear. He said AI is now more expensive than a human worker. Not in 5 years, not at some future scale, right now. And here's the thing. Most startup founders are already experiencing this. They just have not connected the dots yet. Because the cost is not showing up in your salary line. It is not showing up in your headcount. It is showing up quietly every single month on your AWS bill. And wait till the end of this video to know exactly how to fix it and the tools required. A quick intro before we get into it. I worked as a data architect and a data engineer in enterprise environments for close to a decade. And now I work independently as a freelancer, helping startups with their data infrastructure and cloud cost. What I kept seeing in both worlds was the same thing. Smart teams, good engineers, and cloud bills that grew in ways nobody could fully explain. That pattern is what I study now, and everything I share comes from what I'm actually finding inside real client environments, not theory. If you want to follow along, my LinkedIn is in the description below. I share what I find there every single day. Now let us get into it. So let me give you some context on what the CEO actually said, because it is important to understand what he meant. NVIDIA makes the GPUs the specialized chip that power almost every AI model and AI tool that exists right now. ChatGPT runs on NVIDIA chips. Claude runs on NVIDIA chips. Every AI coding tool your engineers use, Cursor, GitHub, Copilot, Amazon Q, all of them run on NVIDIA hardware. So when the CEO of NVIDIA says AI is more expensive than a human worker, he's not being pessimistic about AI. He is the person who profits from AI adoption. He has every reason to make AI sound cheap and easy. And he's still saying it is expensive. What he means specifically is this. The compute cost, the cost of running AI models at scale, has crossed the threshold. At enterprise scale, you are now paying more to run AI than you would pay a human to do the same work. Now here's why this matters for your startup specifically. You are not at an enterprise scale, not yet, but the same dynamic is playing out inside your company right now, just smaller and quieter. Every AI coding tool your team uses to ship faster is making infrastructure decisions. Decisions about how much compute to use, how much storage to provision, how much services to spin up, what configurations to set. And unlike a human engineer who might revisit those decisions 6 months later, the AI generates and moves on. The decisions stick, the costs run every single month. The speed illusion. Here's the part that trips up almost every founder I talk to. AI code tools feel like they reduce cost, and in one specific way, they do. Your engineers used to spend 2 days building a feature. Now they spend 2 hours. It is a real savings. That engineer's time in that sprint, in that feature. But here's what most founders are not tracking. There are two kinds of costs in a startup. Development costs, infrastructure costs. Development costs, what you pay your engineers to build things. This is one time, you pay once and the feature exists. Infrastructure cost, what you pay AWS to run those things. This is recurring. You pay every single month forever, whether anyone uses the feature or not. AI coding tools are extraordinary at reducing the first cost. They are creating an invisible problem with the second one. Because when your engineer spends 2 days building a feature, they think about architecture. They consider storage classes. They question whether the service tier makes sense. They have time to make deliberate decisions. When an AI tool generates the same features in 2 hours, that thinking time is gone. The AI makes infrastructure decisions instead. And the AI does not know your specific situation. It does not know your user count. It does not know your budget. It does not know that you are a 15-person startup, not a 500-person enterprise. It just generates what it has been trained on. It has been trained on documentation to write for production systems at scale. So AI-generated infrastructure looks like enterprise infrastructure, but it also costs like an enterprise infrastructure for a product that may have only 50 users. 3 patterns AI coding creates. Let me show you exactly what this looks like in practice. 3 specific patterns I see in startup in AWS accounts that have been built primarily with AI coding tools. Pattern 1. AI defaults to production grade everything. Here's a real example. An AI engineer uses an AI tool to build a data processing feature. The AI generates the infrastructure. It creates an RDS database with multi-availability zone enabled. Because every AWS best practices document says to use multi-availability zone for reliability in production. Multi-availability zone is absolutely the right call for a production system serving thousands of users where downtime costs you real money. It is not the right call for a prototype with 50 users where 50 minutes of downtime during an availability zone would be a minor inconvenience. Multi-availability zone roughly doubles your RDS cost. On a DBT3 medium, that is the difference between $60 per month and $120 per month. Multiply that across 5 or 10 AI-generated services, all defaulting to production-grade configurations, and you have a bill that is 40 to 60% higher than it needs to be. Not because your product is big, because your AI reads the documentation. Pattern 2. AI provisions for imaginary skills. AI coding tools are trained on tutorials and examples. Tutorials and examples show configurations that work well at scale because tutorials want to teach you the right way to do things. So when your AI generates a Lambda function, it does not provision it for your 100 daily active users. It provisioned it for the workload described in the documentation that it was trained on. Lambda pricing is memory multiplied by duration for every invocation. An AI-generated function might be provisioned at 512 megabytes or 1 gigabyte. The actual work that function does might require 128 megabytes. This is 4 to 8 times more memory than you need on every invocation. Every day, thousands of times. The fix is a free tool called Lambda Power Tuning that tests your function at every memory setting and tells you the optimal configuration. It takes 30 minutes to run, but nobody runs it because the function is working and the team is busy shipping the next AI-generated feature. Pattern 3. AI never looks back. This is one that compounds the most over time. When a human engineer builds something, they occasionally revisit it. They notice when it is abnormally oversized for the current load. They suggest optimizations in code reviews. They bring it up when the build grows. AI tools do not do this. They generate the infrastructure and move on. The configuration that made sense or seemed to make sense when the feature was launched ran unchanged 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later. The startup grew. The architecture did not evolve with it, or the startup did not grow as fast as planned. The architecture was sized for a growth trajectory that never arrived. Either way, the AI-generated defaults are still running exactly as they were set on day one. And here is Flexera data that backs this up. The Flexera 2026 State of the Cloud report found the cloud waste rose to 29% for the first time in 5 years. Their explanation: AI workloads adding new cost complexity that teams have not yet built governance around. The CEO confirmed the cost. Flexera confirmed waste. Your AWS bill is where both of these things showing up. The real business. When we make this concrete with numbers, take a startup spending around $15,000 per month on AWS. It's a Series A company with 20 engineers, most features built with AI coding tools over the last 12 months. Pattern 1. Production grade default across 8 to 10 major services. Estimated unnecessary cost 20%, that is $3,000 per month. Pattern 2. Over provision Lambda and compute across 15 to 20 functions. Estimated unnecessary cost 8%, that is $1,200 per month. Pattern 3. Configurations never revisited after launch. Estimated unnecessary cost 10%, that is $1,500 per month. Total $5,700 per month, $68,400 every year. The decision made by AI tools that nobody goes back to check. That is not a small number. At Series A, that is meaningful percentage of runway. That is the difference between 18 months and 22 months before your next rise. That's the difference between having the leverage to negotiate your Series B or having the pressure of running out of time. The CEO was talking about enterprise cost. Your version of his comments is $68,000 per year, leaving your account quietly while your team ships the next feature. The 3 fixes. Good news. This is one of the fixable cost problems for a startup. You do not need to rebuild your architecture. You do not need to slow down shipping. You need 3 habits. Fix 1. One question before any AI-generated infrastructure ships. Before your engineer merges any AI-generated infrastructure code, ask one question. Is this configuration right for our actual current scale? Or is this a production configuration for a company 10 times our size? That question takes 2 minutes. It catches the majority of expensive defaults before they run. Make it a standing item in every pull request review that touches infrastructure. Fix 2. Add Infracost to your CI/CD pipeline. Infracost is a free open source tool. You can add it to your GitHub Actions or whatever CI/CD pipeline you use. So every time someone opens a pull request that changes infrastructure, Infracost automatically calculates the monthly cost of those changes and posts it as a comment on the pull request. Your engineer sees the cost before the code ships, not after, not 6 months later when the bill had grown. It takes one afternoon to set up, it runs automatically forever, and it turns cost awareness from a reactive audit into a proactive part of how your team ships. Fix 3. A 30-minute AI infrastructure audit, once per quarter. Pull every resource your team created in the last 90 days. For each one, ask 3 questions. Is this right size for our actual current user count, not our projected user count? Is the storage class appropriate for how this data is actually being accessed? Does this need to run 24 hours a day, or can it be scheduled to stop outside of business hours? Most teams find 15 to 25% in recoverable spend in this audit every quarter from an infrastructure that was generated correctly at the time and simply was not revisited as the product and the user base evolved. The CEO of NVIDIA said AI is more expensive than a human worker. He was talking about the compute cost at enterprise scale, but the principle applies at every scale. AI tools generate infrastructure the way documentation describes it, not the way your specific startup needs it, and the gap between those two things runs on your AWS bill every single month, whether anyone checks it or not. Startups that navigate the AI era successfully are not the ones that stop using AI coding tools. They keep using them, they ship fast, they stay competitive, but they also built the habit of checking what the AI provisioned before it ran and revisiting those decisions as the company evolves. One question in the pull request, one free tool in the pipeline, one 30-minute audit per quarter. That's the difference between an AWS bill that grow with your users and the one that grow regardless of them. If this was useful, follow me on LinkedIn. I post one breakdown like this every single day, specifically for startup founders and CDOs. The link is in the description below and subscribe here for the weekly deep dives. Every video connects a real business pattern to something practical you can act on this week. See you in the next one.